We're starting a new series that I've called Different. And the basic premise behind this series is simple. That if you have faith in your life that connects you in a living way to Jesus Christ, that faith ought to make a difference in your life. And that faith ought to cause you to live your life differently than others. I'm going to explore this series, not so much by writing new messages, but I'm going to look back over the last decade of preaching and teaching. And I kind of want to pull some of the messages that have meant the most to me to answer the question, how should faith make a difference in your life and help us to live lives that are different and impactful. So let's go to one of my favorite passages that I just absolutely love in chapter 9, beginning at verse 1. First 8 verses and verse 13. If you're able to stand, we encourage you to stand. We're going to read this together. A difference. Listen to this amazing narrative. One day David asked, is anyone in Saul's family still alive? Anyone to whom I can show kindness? Shout kindness for Jonathan's sake. He summoned a man named Ziba, who had been one of Saul's servants. Are you Ziba? The king asked. Yes, sir, I am, Ziba replied. The king then asked him, is anyone still alive from Saul's family? If so, I want to show God's kindness. Everybody shout God's kindness to them. Ziba replied, yes, one of Jonathan's sons still alive. He's crippled in both feet. Where is he? The king asked. Lodabar, Ziba told him, at the home of Machir, son of Amiel. So David sent for him and brought him from Machir's home. Now his name was Mephibosheth. He was Jonathan's son and Saul's grandson. When he came to David, he bowed low to the ground in deep respect. David said, greeting, Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth replied, I am your servant. Don't be afraid, David said. I intend to show, everybody shout, kindness to you because of my promise to your father, Jonathan. I will give you all the property that once belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will eat here with me at the king's table. Mephibosheth bowed respectfully and exclaimed, who is your servant that you should show such, everybody shout, kindness to a dead dog like me? Verse 13. And Mephibosheth, who was crippled in both feet, lived in Jerusalem and ate regularly at the king's table. Everybody shout amen. Amen. Please be seated. In the first chapter of 1 Peter, you'll find one of the primary disciples of Jesus teaching those who would follow Jesus with these words, "In everything you do, be holy." Then he quotes the Hebrew text from that, where God declares, be ye holy, for I am holy. Everybody shout holy. That's the biblical word for different. Saying that if you are following Jesus, you should be different, not in a kind of creepy, frightening kind of way. Different, not in a kind of I'm better than you kind of way. But different in the sense that you have been grabbed by the love of God, and it has created in you a loyalty to God, and it is that loyalty that is the greatest loyalty in your life, and it affects how you live. Your loyalty to God affects how you approach work. It should affect how you spend your money. It ought to affect the kind of decisions you make in your personal life. Your loyalty to God ought to affect how you treat other people, those that you like hanging around with and those that you don't like hanging around. Your loyalty to God ought to impact how you engage. Listen to what Jesus says about this notion of being loyal to God impacting you. And first, in John chapter 13, here's what Jesus says. He says, here's a new commandment I give you. Take all the old commandments, roll it up in this one. love one another. Shout one another. It's talking to the Christian community that's full of everybody, the good, the bad, the ugly. And here's a little insight. All of us have a little good, bad, and ugly. And Jesus says, and I have loved you with all that I am. And I'm saying to you, if you're loyal to me based on how I've loved you, you need to learn to love each other. All the good, the bad, the ugly. Love, loyalty to God drives a difference. Everybody shout difference. That's what I like about this text. It is really talking about love. And as I back into this text, I on yesterday, I think over 1 billion people, I'm sure you were among them, watched the royal wedding. And I had to prepare for you guys, so I didn't have a chance to watch the royal wedding, but I recorded it. Thank God for DVRs. And so when I get home, after I watch the Warriors, I will then later tonight enjoy all the festivities around this remarkable royal wedding. However, while I was preparing, I got a YouTube clip, I don't know, the algorithm, however it happened, popped on my thing. And it featured the fiery preacher, the first African-American bishop of the Episcopal Church. And he preached a sermon for 10 minutes. It was a 10-minute sermon. And so I watched it, and I was so both impressed and blessed. I mean, here he was in this kind of super formal, stuffy, the queen, the prince, the actors and actresses, everybody was there. And he was both brilliant and funny and just black. I loved it. He was fully himself as he exegeted the text and preached. And I said, whoa, that's the bomb. I mean, if he can preach like that amidst the queen and the princes and all the knights, I'm all right then. I can be black at NBCC, right? Bring my passion and all of that to the table. I like it. Anyway, the power of the PowerPoint of his message was really one. It was all about what? You said it. Love. His point was that the God who is love made all that we know in the world from a heart of love. And if we can release that love, that God kind of love, it can literally not only change our lives, but in fact, change the world. Everybody shout, God kind of love. That's what's actually hidden in this text about David and Mephibosheth. This notion of a God kind of love. It's a radical love that has the tendency of breaking every category that you can imagine and reaching and loving all those who we would tend to conclude is beyond the reach of love. It's in the text, and it's easily overlooked because they use a couple of words to describe it. In chapter, in verse 1, it starts off by saying, David was asking the question, is there anybody in Saul's family who's still alive? Anybody, so that I can show some kindness. Everybody shout kindness. The word beneath that, the Hebrew word beneath that, is hesed. Everybody say hesed. All right, hesed. That's the Hebrew word. That is a kind of radical love. We see it again in verse 7 when he says, if anybody is still alive from Saul's family, because ultimately I want to show them God's kindness. Everybody shout God's kindness. Same word, hesed, hesed, hesed. And then we see it again in verse 7 when he brings Mephibosheth before him and he gives to Mephibosheth this lavish expression of grace. He restores all of the wealth and all of that on there. And he says, I have intended to show you kindness, but the word beneath that is still hesed, this God kind of love. Mind-blowing love. We see it in Psalms 23, verse 6. It's easily missed. We read it at verse 6. It says, surely your goodness and what? Mercy. The New Living Translation puts it like this. Surely God's goodness and unfailing love. Everybody shout, unfailing love. That God has a love that finds you wherever you are and never fails you. See, people, we have failing love. It's up today and down tomorrow. But this is remarkable. Hesed. This is another way of translating it is a loyal love. A radical, loyal, unfailing love, or God kindness, if you will, in the text. Now, we see how it works. The two main characters that the text starts off with is Saul. Saul is the first king of Israel. And what's unique about it, in 1 Samuel chapter 9, you'll find how it was that God called him to be king. He sent Samuel the prophet to him, and he said to him, I've picked you to be the first king. Here's how Saul talks about himself. Listen, I like this. He says, essentially, I'm from the smallest tribe in Israel, Benjamin. And my family is the most insignificant family in the tribe. And by implications, I'm the most unreligious, insignificant person in this insignificant family. And you're calling me to be king? I thought that I was beyond the reach or something like that. And it's just a reminder that God is always looking first and foremost for the people who feel like they are beyond the reach of love. I like David because if I fast forward to chapter 16 in 1 Samuel, and Saul ultimately becomes king and he's disobedient and he misuses, and at the end of the day God fires him and shows him that now David is the man that I'm raising up, and Saul is so jealous that he tries to kill David, and God takes Jonathan, Saul's son, and helps to save David. It's one thing to say that I've got God kind of love in my life. It's another thing to be able to recognize God's love when it's happening in your life. And David recognized that when the son of the man who's trying to kill me is my best friend, there must be God loving me somewhere. And so Jonathan ultimately cuts a covenant with David and says, look, I know you're going to be king. He says, I know you're going to be king, not because you're so brilliant, not because you're such a great warrior. You're going to be king. I know you're going to be king because God has declared that you're going to be the next king of Israel. Now, here's a little word in this for anybody here just listening. Listen, when God says you have an assignment, when God says you have a position, when God says I'm calling you to do this particular work, it really doesn't matter how little education you have or how great your challenge is in front of you or who's trying to stop you. If God has declared, I have this for you, the only person can stop you is you. God has for you. Can't anybody do anything about it but you. But you. And so Jonathan says, look, I want you to make a covenant with me. Because in that day it was the king's tradition that when they assumed power, they would wipe out the heirs of their predecessors to keep people from uprising against. He says, look, I want you to preserve my line. So now, verse 1 opens up. David has consolidated his power, and he remembers how God was active in his life through Jonathan, and he remembers the kind of way that God loved him and the covenant that he makes. And so he says, is there anybody around from Saul's house that I can show some God kindness, some lavish, radical, that breaks all category kindness to the same way that God showed to me? There's a great story about David, and I love it. It's when the prophet went to David's house to tell him that God had picked him to be king many years earlier. Jesse was his father, and the prophet asked for the father to bring all his boys out and put the anointing over them to see which one God would say is the one. And Jesse brought out all 7 of his boys, brought out 7 boys. And the prophet finished and he said, none of these boys are the one. And then the prophet said, are you sure you don't have any more kids? And then Jesse said, oh, yes, my 8th boy. Yes, he's out there with the sheep. You know, he's a kind of ruddy kind of fella. You know, I know God don't want to do anything with him. He's out there with the sheep. He's smelling. The prophet said, well, I'll just sit here and wait. Go get him. And when David walked through the door, the text says, and God said to the prophet, that's the one I've chosen. You see the point? You see the point? You see the point? The one that everybody has counted out. The one that even his father has forgotten about. See, some of you come from well-resourced families, but the reality is you grew up in a family knowing and believing that mama's favorite was the other 3, not you. Come on. The reality of the family is that you grew up there, come on, and you have yet to hear daddy say, I'm proud of you, but he shows his pride is for all the other kids. Here, you kind of forgotten. You kind of forgotten. And God says, I just want to talk to you a little bit. I see you. And I claim you. Hesed, you see. Hesed. That's a radical God kind of law. David said, I want to show some Hesed. And so the steward of Saul's property comes forth and says, yeah, Jonathan has a son who's alive. And he's crippled in both feet. Everybody say crippled. Last week I talked about the woman bent over the crippled woman. If you were here this week, I thought I'd talk about a crippled man. I'm crippled in both feet. Shout, crippled in both feet. Well, he could have meant by that, the scholars have tried to figure it out, he might have been saying, well, David, you know, the fact of the matter is he's crippled in both feet. He poses no harm to you. But most likely he was saying, because David has already said, he didn't say call him here so I can kill him. David says, I want to bless him with lavish love. So most likely, what Ziba was saying was, well, there is a boy of Jonathan that is still alive, but I don't really think he qualifies for what you're talking about because he's not just crippled in one foot, he's crippled in both feet. Shout, both feet. See, when you're crippled in one feet, you're still good for something. When you're crippled in one feet, you can still work. You know, you just use an extra stick. You can still work. When you're crippled in one foot, you have potential. But when in that day you're crippled in both feet, that means you're not good for nothing. You can't work. That would suggest in that day and time that you have no potential. Now, here is a word when David, the king, says, where is he? He's in Lodebar. And David says, call him forth. Well, here is a wonderful word David is illustrating for you and for me how God sees these situations. And what he's saying, here's a word for anyone who's disabled, who's in a wheelchair, who's blind. Here's a word for anyone who's struggling with mental health challenges and you've concluded that you are good for nothing. Here's a word word for anyone whose past is so broken that you've concluded that it has broken and destroyed your future. God declares, listen here, he says, I can take anybody and do the incredible with. Come on. As I asked Roosevelt, he was in a wheelchair. I made him president. Ask Stevie, he couldn't see, and he changed the world with his music. Ask Thomas Edison's mother, who struggled with mental illness, and yet she raised the genius of the century. I know how to love. Come on now. I can take anybody and make greatness out of them. The only thing that disqualifies you from God's plan ultimately is you. You're refusing to listen. You're refusing to believe. You're refusing to trust. Your refusal to surrender. But he's saying, I want you. You. And the more disqualified you look in the world, the greater I can use you. Shout Lodabar. David said, where does he live? Oh, he said, well, he lives in Lodabar. You know, my wife and daughter, they tease me about how my country accent causes me to mangle some words along the way. And so I said, well, that's true. And I think about this Lodabar. Everybody shout Lodabar. You know, for me, I start talking about it, and my country accent gets in. Before I know it, I'm saying below the bar. Come on, when you say it with me, say below the bar. Come on, below the bar. Say it again. Below the bar, below the bar, below the bar. See, when you're crippled in both feet, when you have concluded, and I just want you to know that, come on now, you can have tons of resources and education and still conclude that you are crippled in both feet, that you are not usable by God. You see what I'm saying? And when you're crippled in both feet, come on now, you live what I call in the place called below the bar, below the expectations of God's best, below the bar, below believing that God can use you, below the bar, below believing that God's grace is even for you, below the bar. You live in the place where you see more obstacles than opportunities, where you focus on what you can't do, can't be, rather than on who God has called you to be. Below the bar. That's where Mephibosheth lived. Below the bar. Let me run a test to see, is your address below the bar? If you were watching the royal wedding on yesterday and you found yourself saying something like this, I wish I was her. I wish I was him. That's probably a sign to suggest that you are living in below the bar. You know why? Because you have concluded that what you see on TV is far more valuable than who you are. You know what you've missed? What you have missed is, you are the only you in all eternity. You are the only you that God has. Before you were born, there was never another you. When you leave the planet, there will never, ever be another you. You are uniquely shaped and different. And God said, don't worry about trying to be somebody else. You can never be the best at being somebody else. You can be the best being who I've called you to be. Be the you I made you to be. But you know, living in below the bar has a way of seducing us. Well, how did Mephibosheth become crippled in the first place? Well, what a great question for you to ask. 2 Samuel 4:4 gives us how he became crippled. It says that when the news came to his house that his father, Jonathan, his grandfather, had been killed in war, Mephibosheth was 5 years old. The nurse grabbed him up to try to escape because the enemy was coming towards to take over the house. And so she was rushing and she grabbed him up. And the text says that on her way out, she dropped him. Everybody shout, dropped him. 5 years old. And when she dropped him, it says he crushed his ankle. Now, what the theologians say, most likely she didn't just drop him. She stumbled and dropped him and fell on him. And that led to a crushing of his ankle. And that's how he got crippled and why he ended up in Lodabar. Well, let me ask you, who dropped you? Let me tell you a story. I was in Boston, pastoring Rock's Prayers, and on one Sunday, just like this one, I preached 2 services, 2 gatherings, and I had a host of meetings afterwards, and then I had some counseling sessions, and then at about 3 o'clock, the building was empty, and so was I. And I headed towards the door. I was the last one to leave, and I opened the front door, getting ready to exit. There was a young woman standing outside the door. Her hair was disheveled. Her clothes were dirty. Her breath was perfumed with alcohol. She said to me, "My life is in a mess, so I'm looking for the preacher. Can you tell me where he is?" And I was exhausted, y'all. I wanted to say, I don't know where the preacher is. And, you want to come back next Sunday? I'm just being fruitful. Can I just be honest? I was exhausted, but the integrity within me, I felt like God was watching. I'm standing in the church. I just was, to be honest. Come on now. I said, I am the preacher. She said, can you help me? My life is in tatters. Can I just come in and talk to you for a few moments? And I wanted to say, well, can you just come back next week at about 11 o'clock afterwards? But then I remembered that I couldn't remember, talking about himself, God himself. I could not ever remember time when I turned to Jesus and he said, come back next week. Come on. And so since I'm representing him, I needed to bear some more grace, some hyssop. I said, come on in. She sat down in the pew, and I sat in another in front of her, and she just laid it out. She said her mama won't talk to her. Her sponsor has lost confidence in her. She said that she's lost confidence in herself. She said every time I try to get it right, I mess it up, and I mess it up, and I mess it up, and I mess it up. And she said, "Can you help me?" And I sat there and I thought for a moment. I'm thinking, I can't help myself. Come on. Because we all got some good, some bad, some ugly, do we not? Come on, we all got some stuff, and this stuff is complicated. But if you are open to the instrument of the God of creation who made everybody, come on now, he can drop something right in the moment when you need it. So I sat back and I said in myself quietly, God help, and he dropped an insight. And then I said to her, you've told me about all your pains. I said, now, what I need you to do now is tell me about the pain. She said, excuse me. I said, yes. I said, we all have a pain that's bigger than all the other pain that drives us in the wrong direction. I said, it's usually rooted in our childhood. In other words, I was trying to find out who dropped her. And she said, she said, I don't understand what you're saying. My life is just, I said, no. If you would just be quiet just for a moment and allow the silence of the sanctuary to sink in, just be quiet and get in touch with your feelings. And I believe you will remember the pain. So let's just be quiet just for a moment. And in a few seconds, she broke the quietness. She said, he left me. And I said, who left you? She said, my father. And she began to describe the situation. Like Marco, the prince that got married yesterday, she too was biracial. Her father was African American. Her mother was an Asian American. And they had come to Boston. She was 12 years old. She was, in fact, the apple of her father's eye. She talked about how he loved on her and cared for her. And then one day, he was gone. With no explanation, and next thing she knew, there was a divorce. And the next thing she knew, she just couldn't find him anywhere. No word from him. And for 15 years, she said she searched for him. She searched for him. And finally, she discovered he was in Florida. And when she flew to Florida, she discovered that when she arrived one day too late. He died the day just before she got there. See, her father dropped her at 12. Crippled her in both feet. And when I heard that, I realized what was going on. See, she had a hole that was vacated because of the absence of her father. And so I began to talk to her. I said, I understand that your father has been missing from your life, but I want to give you a word. Here's the word. You did not come from your father and mother. You came through your father and mother. You came from the creator of the universe. He ultimately is the great parent of your life. And I just thought to tell you, he has loved you with an everlasting love. Hyssop, come on now. He has never forsaken you, never abandoned you. Come on now, from the crack house to the church house, he's been with you every day. And he's saying, let me love you. I can love you better than your daddy loves you. And I wish you could have seen the reaction that took place. The action that took place. Come on, can I just ask you, who dropped you? Who dropped you? See, there's not much difference between me and that woman. And I hear you now. You say, wait a moment, Pastor, wait a moment. Did you not say that her hair was disheveled? I did. Well, Pastor, you don't have any hair. What do you mean there's not much difference between the two of you? You said that the clothes were dirty. Your clothes not dirty. Come on. Did you say breath got alcohol? You don't drink. You don't drug. You don't do any of that. No. Well, how are you comparing yourself? Because I got dropped, y'all. The reason why I love this text is because life dropped me. When I was 6 months old, I broke out with impetigo rash that left me scarred for life. Life dropped me. When a year later, my father dropped me. He showed up after the hospital and said, you're not mine, and rejected and abandoned me. Come on now. And I ended up in Lodabar. Come on. While I was in Coshada, I was growing up, and I was destructive because I didn't know about his hyssop love. I just felt ugly, so I acted ugly. Felt stupid, so I acted stupid. I'm telling you my story. Nobody would have believed. As a matter of fact, I ran into one of my former teachers a few years ago. He's now a pastor, and I was a pastor. We were going up the pulpit together. He said, Hurmon, is that you? I said, yes, Reverend, because it's me. He said, Hurmon, I still have nightmares about when you were in my class. Nobody would have ever believed that the young man who would take rubber bands and put them together and take little strips of paper and turn it into slingshot paper, come on now, and pop young ladies on the backside. Nobody would ever believe he would be a pastor today. Come on now. Nobody would ever believe that young man would sit in an auditorium would make spitballs, come on, and throw it on people all over the place. No one would have suggested he's going to be, come on, preaching on a Sunday morning. Nobody who knew him then, teachers who prayed, Lord, please don't let him get in my class. None of them would have believed that this young man, come on now, God would pick him up and turn him around and turn him right side up and bring him to where he is. But I tell you, I ran into Jesus, y'all. I ran into his hyssop love, his grace, his forgiveness, his purpose, his power. And even though I was crippled in both feet, God lifted me to where I am today. That's the God that wants to love you. It's a radical kindness. Breaks all category. It restores. Everybody shout, restores. Restore from what? Restore what? I can hear the questions you're asking. I like the way restore from what. Watch the text. Watch the text. Verse 6 says his name was Mephibosheth. He was Jonathan's son and Saul's grandson. He came to David and fearing that the king would wipe him out. The Hebrew means he fell on his face. He said, by demonstration, I'm your servant. Don't kill me. See, some of us won't go before God because we're afraid he's going to kill us. we've got stuff ringing in our ears about what we learned early on, about how God treats folk who are bad. And yet, did I not tell you earlier that everybody has some bad, some good, and some ugly? Did I not tell you that? And so we are afraid to go before the God of lightning and thunder. But that God showed up in Jesus. Come on now. And he says that if you grew up in a house of tragedy and pain, that's the house of Saul. I've come here today asking, where are you? Can you come? I can see this man. Lord have mercy. I can see this fellow crippled in both feet, y'all. And it's hard to get around him. And they put him off because David sent a ride and brought him. And I can see him, he's trying to get into the palace. And the kids are making fun of him like they used to do. But he said, I got to ignore that because the king called me. Come on. And the palace guard is saying, somebody like you're not supposed to be here. But he said, I understand, but the king called me. Now, I can see him coming, but when he gets in the presence, he's afraid. David says what God says to y'all today, don't be afraid. He said, don't be afraid. He says, watch this. He says, I intend to show you some hyssop love, radical kindness. He says, I'm going to take all the property that used to belong to your grandfather. Watch it. I'm going to give it to you. All the servants that he used to have, I'm giving it to you. All the property, I'm giving it all to you. And guess what? You're going to sit and eat at my table. I'm going to treat you like my own son. Well, shout restore. Okay, you see what life will do in Lodabar is that it will damage your self-perception. Because what is his response? His response is, who is your servant that you would show such God kindness to a dead dog like me? See, I would have thought that he would started celebrating. But he said a dead dog. Listen, shout dead dog. I mean, a dog is bad enough. But even a dog has some potential to bless. I mean, if you tell a dog go fetch, he'll go get your shoes and bring them. Come on. If a dog is considered a man or a woman best friend, I know some people who've kicked some other people out and kept the dog. A dog can be helpful, y'all. But a dead dog, what can you do with a dead dog? A dead dog is beyond hope. And what he's saying is, who am I? I'm beyond hope. And he had forgotten who he is, y'all. But the writer's trying to remind us. He says he's the son of Jonathan. That means Jonathan is a prince. He's the son of a prince. Saul is his granddaddy. He's the grandson of a king. In other words, Mephibosheth held the same position that Prince Harry, who got married on yesterday, held. Come on now. Prince Harry's father, Charles, is the prince. His mama is the queen. Y'all ain't listening. So Mephibosheth and Prince Harry, they were in the same position. But Prince Harry had understanding of who he is. But Mephibosheth, the life had broken his identity. But if you let God love you the way God wants to love you, he'll restore your sense of value. He'll show you, come on now, you are worth my sending my son, dying on Calvary's cross, getting up to give you what you can't get on your own. Watch it. When I get through with you, you're going to remember you're royal. I'm going to move you from poverty to wealth. I'm going to move you from outside the town into Jerusalem. I'm going to move you from a place of no influence to sit you at my table where all the affairs of states are discussed, and now you have great impact. In other words, just let me have your life and give me time, because it won't happen overnight, but over time. Come on now. If you would just execute what I tell you, I'll take your upside down life and turn it right side up, because that's just how I love y'all. Isn't that amazing? But all you have to do is to be able to believe it. Well, let me tell you the test of my belief. And this is why I conclude. Notice how this story ends. So often in the church, we like to tie things up neatly. But in life, things are not tied up neatly. While this is a healing story, the man does not become uncrippled. At least not in his feet. The text says in verse 13, And so, Mephibosheth was crippled in both feet. But he lived in Jerusalem, and he ate at the king's table. And you would think he would have become uncrippled. Well, he did, but he didn't. He's still crippled. Yeah, well, let me explain to you, and I'll conclude here. It is, listen. When I was about 14 years old, my birth mom came back into my life, and she said to me, "You're scarred, and I know people making fun of you. You're now a teenager. I'm willing to send you to a place and get a wig fitted for you so we can cover up the scars." And she said, "Think about it." There was something instinctively that wanted to say no within, but I stopped because God was already working by then. He was already turning me around. He was already transforming how I saw myself, therefore how people saw me. And then I went to one of my friends. She's still one of my best friends today, like a sister, Charlene. We call her Charlie. And I went to her house and I told her what happened. She said, "Well, Hurmon, hyssop love." She said, "Hurmon, you can get a wig if you want. But I'm just telling you, we like you the way you are." As a matter of fact, she said, "We love you the way you are." Come on. And she said, you can try to cover up. She said, "Hurmon, we don't even see your scars. She said, we just see you." Come on, that's what happens when the glory of God begins to work in your life. But then, come on, run fast. When I got a little older, I had the resources if I wanted to do plastic surgery. But by then, God had been so great in my life, I concluded, you know what? I'm going to be like Mephibosheth. I'm going to sit at the king's table, and I'm going to let everybody see that I'm crippled in both feet. Well, I want everybody to see my scars. Why? Because, see, these scars, they used to represent shame and guilt and powerlessness and lostness. But now, after God has loved me with hyssop, come on now, that hyssop love, oh my God, the same scars, you have to squint to see them, but get close enough. By the way, all of y'all got scars. Come on now, you just got to get close enough to see you, squint to see you, and when you see them, you see the evidence of God's grace, the evidence of God's love, the evidence of God's mercy, the evidence of God's power with scars. Y'all ain't listening to me. I'm the husband of Dr. Rhonda Hamilton. With scars, I'm the father of Jonathan and Lauren. With scars, I'm the pastor of New Beginnings Community Church of the Bay Area. Broken, crippled with both feet. With scars, God is using me, and he will use you. Praise God. See, so what I've just explained to you is why I try to be loyal to God. Because of how he has loved me. I've just explained to you why I'm so passionate about trying to preach Jesus to as many as I can. Because of how he continues to love this imperfect me. He's the one I want to introduce you to. And everybody said amen.